So we'll begin with some key definitions that we must be aware of to understand all that I'll be talking about. Uh, yeah, the first of which is reproductive success. Uh, Many of you might be aware of these terms, but I thought I'll just go through it in the beginning so that we are all on the same page. So the reproductive success essentially defines an individual's production of offspring over an entire lifetime. Then we also have reproductive fitness, which is different because it talks about the number of offsprings that actually go on to reproduce and perpetuate the parents' genes. So it basically talks about next generation's ability to reproduce as well. Then we have fecundity, which is the number of offsprings which are produced by an individual over one reproductive episode. So every time it reproduces, how many eggs or offspring it is producing. Then there is fertility, which is slightly different. It talks about the number of offspring that are born per mating pair. Then there is clutch size. Everyone is aware of clutch size, I'm sure. There's a number of eggs produced. So in that sense, it is equivalent to fecundity for birds. And parity is the number of episodes of reproduction that an individual experiences over an entire lifetime. And finally, longevity is how long an individual lives. So everyone is clear about these terms. We need to remember them through the course of the lecture. So what is life history? So life history is basically the lifetime pattern of growth, development and reproduction that an individual experiences. And because any individual and any species has access to a certain amount of resources that it must allocate to all these three processes, so it has to make some decisions on how much energy is it going to devote to each of these processes. And the end goal for everyone is actually to increase its reproductive success and eventually fitness. So that's your end goal. You have a limited amount of resources, and then every individual has to decide the best possible way of allocating the resources to all these three processes. And because growth, reproduction, development themselves involve many stages. So you can imagine there are many, at each stage, the individual has to take some decisions. Also, all of these processes are also influenced by environmental factors, right? That will determine the amount of resources that are available. And also, there are biotic factors like influence of competitors, the body condition of the individual itself, how many predators are there in the environment. So, as a result of all these variations, in the natural world, what we see is that species employ very varied life history strategies to get to the same end goal of optimizing their reproductive success. And sometimes what we see is seemingly similar birds have very different life history strategies. In this example, on the right side is a thrush. Typically, they start breeding in the first year of their life, produce 3 to 4 eggs every breeding cycle, and rarely live for more than 3 or 4 years. On this side is a petrel, which is almost similar in body size, but it starts reproducing at 4 or 5 years of age, produces only one young one every year, and lives on for 30 to 40 years. So you can see very similar, seemingly similar birds also can have very varied life history strategies. So before we go on to look at all the complex trade-offs that individuals make, let's just try to understand what are the important stages of life history. And as I already told you, the end goal is to increase the fitness, which basically means that every individual wants to produce very able offspring which are able to themselves reproduce in future. So we have to consider multiple generations when we are looking at stages of life history. So when you come to the parents, there are two important factors that they are investing energy in. One is just surviving, which is adult survival, and the second thing is reproduction. And there are many stages or decisions that an individual has to make with respect to each of these. For instance, let's just consider reproduction. It has to first decide how many, first of all, when should it start reproducing? At what stage or what age should it start reproducing. That's the first decision. The second thing is, every time it reproduces, should it produce few large offspring or many small offspring? So that's another decision. Then when it has offspring or it whatever reproduces, it has to decide how much time it wants to invest in parental care versus maintaining its own fitness, like survival. Then again, it has to decide over a lifetime how many time should it be, just parallel. So it has to take all these decisions over a lifetime. When it comes to the offspring, again it has to decide how fast should it grow. Should it grow very fast and start reproducing very soon, or should it grow very slowly and invest on having a long life and reproduce very few offspring? So there are many decisions that the offspring also has to take before it starts reproducing itself. So all these stages essentially involve a lot of decision making at each stage, and all of it is based on how much resources are available to it, and basically it decides how it's going to allocate resources to all these stages. So as I already talked to you about, how much resources are available is essentially a function of the environmental conditions in many cases to begin with. And one of the most broad scale variations that we see in nature, I'll start with one of those, that is, there's a latitudinal gradient in clutch sizes in birds. So we see that among passerines, which are songbirds, we see that the species at the tropics lay fewer eggs at each breeding episode compared to those which breed at higher latitudes or temperate areas. And there have been many arguments why that happens. One of that is, in temperate areas, the winter is very severe, so a lot of birds die. So there is greater amount of food available in the temperate areas for those who survive. So they can invest in having larger clutch sizes. Again, another thing that has been argued is that temperate climate, because it's more climatically variable, the carrying capacities, so basically the population is always maintained way below the carrying capacity. So there's a lot of space, or there's a lot of resources available to add more young ones. And the third argument is also that in temperate areas in the breeding season, in summers, the day length is very long. So the birds can spend more time foraging and getting more food. So they can invest in raising, greater number of chicks. This can also be explained in a slightly different way. So if you look at this is resource availability across the year, and basically temperate areas is indicated in black, and tropical areas are indicated in red and blue. So what they argue is that in temperate areas, there's a big difference in the resource availability between the breeding and non-breeding season, because there is greater mortality. So basically the population in temperate areas is actually regulated by the harshness of the climate in the non-breeding season. So what happens is there's greater mortality in the non-breeding season, so you have an accumulation of a lot of resources towards the breeding season, which is the first argument essentially, and that allows for larger clutch sizes, and this is something which is called Ashmole's hypothesis. Okay. So looking at it, in temperate areas, essentially it looks like having larger clutch sizes is a really good idea, right? Because they have more food, a longer daylight hours to allow more foraging and all. This has been seen in many different groups. So Emberizer buntings, these ducks, and these are these North American orioles. All of them have larger clutch sizes at higher latitudes. Okay, so essentially it seems like it's a great idea to have in temperate areas to have very large clutch sizes, unless there is something negative associated with it. So when you look at, and that's exactly what happens. So it has been seen that as the clutch size increases, the probability of survival of individual offspring goes down. So if there are more eggs in a clutch, chances are that because the parent is it can only invest so much energy to feeding those offspring or in parental care. So the same amount of effort is actually distributed amongst all the chicks it has. So the greater number of chicks, it means that each one is getting lesser investment. So the survival accordingly decreases. So what this means is that if you multiply the number of offspring of clutch size by the odds of, so basically the number of offspring with that particular the points on that particular plot, what you will find is there should be an optimal clutch size, okay, which is at which the survival of individual offspring is highest. So if you go, so it will basically increase as you increase the clutch size to a certain point, and beyond that will start, the individual survival of offspring will start declining, right? And this is what is called Lack's optimal clutch hypothesis, okay? And it has been seen. So in magpies, they did some experimental manipulation. So they provided magpies with 5 eggs, 6 eggs, 7 eggs, and they increased it to 9. And then they found that the number of chicks fledged was highest when it was presented with 7 eggs. It reduced as when it was increased beyond 7 eggs. So this has been found in experimental manipulation. And also, in another study, what they found was that if a bird invests in having a very large clutch size in a particular year, then what happens in subsequent years, it is not able to raise larger clutch sizes. So it compromises on, so if they invest too much in present reproduction, then they lose out on during future reproduction. So what it has been found is that for tits, if birds that laid 12 eggs in their first clutch, in the next year, they essentially ended up using so much energy that they were not able to reproduce the next year in some cases. And they found that for this particular species, laying 8 to 9 eggs per clutch was optimal, and that allowed them to also reproduce in future years. So basically, a bird goes for a strategy that optimizes their overall lifetime reproductive output. You want to go with something so that you can have a good number of chicks fledged each year, and those add up to the biggest possible number over your lifetime. Okay. So essentially, we can see that a life and history strategy is a product of evolution, and basically it reflects adaptation to some environmental conditions in which natural selection took place. So one good question to ask would be, if species that occur in similar environments, do they show similar life history strategies, right? Do you think it's a good question to ask? Ideally, this is what we will expect. And although we see a very wide variety of environmental conditions on Earth, but we'll consider two very basic contrasting scenarios. One environment which is, just imagine if it's very variable and it changes over time very quickly, and the other one which remains stable over time. So we have an unstable, unpredictable environment versus a stable and very predictable environment. And contrasting these, Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson described two contrasting life history strategies. One is R-selected, the second one is K-selected strategies. These terms are actually based on population models, and we'll discuss this in greater detail in tomorrow's lecture when we talk about bird populations. But essentially what happens is that the R-selected species have traits that tries to increase their overall growth rate. How? And it is not individual's growth, it talks about the population's growth rate. And the K-selected species are the ones that have traits that respond to, it's made the population growth rate of a K-selected species is basically maintained by the carrying capacity of the environment. So they basically focus on traits that increase their competitive ability, individuals' competitive ability. So when you apply the R to K scale to reproductive strategies, this basically tries to balance egg output versus parental care. So if you in this picture, on the left hand is our oysters, which produce about 500 million fertilized eggs per year. And on this extreme, so that's an R-selected species. and on this extreme is a gorilla which produces one young one every 5 years. So basically, that doesn't have any zero parental care. It's just trying to increase the units of just the number of offsprings. This one is instead investing in one offspring, but it provides a lot of invests a lot in parental care. So on the life history continuum, typically we see that the R-selected species show high fecundity and very low adult survivorship, whereas the K-selected species, the adult survival is very high, but they show very low fecundity. Okay, so this is how we contrast R-selected and K-selected strategies. And these are the two idealized models, but in nature we see most often species rise somewhere in the middle of these two extremes along the continuum. And most R-selected species inhabit unpredictable environments, and K-selected species inhabit more predictable, stable environments. And in a study done on Great Tits again in Europe, they also found that within the same species, different populations show different strategies. So for Great Tits, populations that occur at very low densities, so basically it has a lot of resources available, right? Fewer individuals but a lot of resources available. They show R-selected strategy, whereas populations that are close to carrying capacity, they show K-selected strategy. Okay, so basically you see a whole range of them when it comes to these strategies within the same species as well. Okay, so as I was talking earlier, there are all these stages of growth, development, and reproduction, and again, more stages within them. And every individual is constantly making decisions on how to most optimally allocate resources between growth and reproduction, right? And so they make some very important trade-offs between survival, growth, and reproduction at every stage. And we'll be discussing some of these in the next two slides. So the first decision that they have to make is, when should they reproduce first? At what age should they reproduce? So if you look at this table, this is a hypothetical table, and the numbers are very high because this table was for fish eggs. So yeah, they obviously produce much more than birds. But if you look at it, this is the age at which an individual starts reproducing, and that is the life expectancy. So how long it lives. Another thing is the numbers that are in bold font, like these 20 here, 40 here, 60 here. These are the most optimal, the highest reproductive success for an individual that lives for that many years for that particular and starts reproducing at this particular age. Okay, so as you can see that as the lifespan increases, the age at which it should reproduce first to get the most reproductive output keeps increasing, right? So the species which live for longer, they should ideally start reproducing later in life to get the maximum reproductive output, right? So for example, something which lives for just 2 years, it should ideally start reproducing within the first year to get, and that's the maximum number it reaches, 20, okay? But something which lives for say 7 years, it gets its maximum reproductive output if it starts reproducing at 4 years of age, right? So anything which lives longer benefits more by starting to reproduce later. And if you look at real life examples, if you look at albatrosses, they have a very high annual survival rate. They live for very long, and they accordingly start reproducing much later in life, at 10 years of age. Whereas most passerines, they have much lower adult survival rate. So only 50% of individuals survive from year to year. They start reproducing much earlier, at 1 year of age. Is reinforced when we look at the influence of breeding experience on reproductive output. So in these shear waters, what they found was that birds, the parents in later years of life had better success at fledging their youngs. So in the initial few years, they are able to fledge very few chicks. But as the experience increases, they get better with making sure that the chicks hatch. Okay. Uh, Again, as I already talked about the trade-off, the investment, they will decide between what is the the best way of allocating resources between reproduction and survival. On this axis is increasing reproductive investment. So basically, an individual, as you go along this axis, is increasing the amount of resources it is investing in reproduction. You see that the adult survival keeps increasing as the investment on reproduction increases, right? So, and this is fecundity. So, the more resources you allocate to reproduction, the more offspring you are producing by the end of it. But the parents, its own survival accordingly goes down. Okay. So, this results in an inverse relationship between adult survival and fecundity. Okay. So, the more you invest towards reproduction, the lower the adult survival is going to be. And this has also been proved through an experimental study. So on kestrels, kestrels. So this was the actual clutch size, the clutch size. And here what they did was they removed 2 chicks, and accordingly you can see the adult survival increased. This is the adult survival, animal adult survival. So when they removed chicks, the adult survival went up. When they added additional chicks that they had to care for, their survival went down. Okay? Okay. So, if F is the fitness, here S refers to the survival probability of the adult. So, S is basically, it includes the survival probability which is directly related to reproduction. This is SR. And this is the survival probability which is related to other factors. And so the survival of the adult is basically a product of both these survival probabilities related to reproduction and those not related to reproduction. And S0 is basically the survival to 1 year of age of the offspring. So how well it is, the probability that it is able to raise the offspring to first year of life. So basically successfully raising an offspring. And B is the number of offspring produced per year. So basically the fitness of an individual is product of its own survival, including that related to reproduction and not related to reproduction, as well as the survival of the offspring. So, and it includes both producing more offspring and raising them to, making them fledge. Raising them successfully. So based on all this, it seems like the ideal strategy for an adult which does not live for long. So basically, it means that these are species which don't have a very high probability of living, the survival probability or the probability of surviving from 1 year to the other is very low. If that is the case, the most optimal strategy seems to be to choose fecundity over survival. So they should, because the chances of them surviving for long is very low, they perform better if they just start reproducing early and try to reproduce as much as possible in the short span of life that is available to them. Okay? In contrast, for species which live for a very long time and whose offspring, they produce fewer offspring which don't have very good survival probability. For them, it makes more sense to instead invest on their own growth and try to survive for as long as possible. Then what happens is that then they can, if they live for long enough and invest in their own growth and fitness or whatever survival, they can have many clutches over a lifetime. And because they're producing fewer ones, they can invest more in parental investment for all those chicks, and as a result of it, over a lifetime can raise many chicks. So if they instead invest on a lot in producing young ones, they lose out on future reproduction opportunity which is available to them. So this is what works out best for them. And similar trade-off is also seen between fertility and survival. We talked about fecundity earlier. Fertility is basically the number of eggs produced per pair every season. So Similarly, the annual adult survival is actually inversely related to how many eggs they produce per season. So there's also a trade-off between growth and fecundity. Like how much are you investing in growing every year? So basically, if you look at, so these are like two hypothetical situations where there's a individual with slow growth and high fecundity, and there is this individual which is growing very rapidly and has low fecundity. And you can see that you can see the difference in reproductive output. Like the one which is growing very slowly, that is accumulating reproductive success very high, and the one which is growing very rapidly, it has low fecundity, so the reproductive success is much lower. Essentially, what it means is that again, it has to again do with life expectancy. So if you're going to, if you know if it's a species which is going to live for a long time, it better invest in growing, right? Because it will have future opportunities to reproduce. But if you are an individual, or if you belong to a species which is a very lower life expectancy, again, it's better to not invest so much in growth, because then you might not be alive next year to reproduce. So as soon as you can reproduce, you should just produce as many offspring as possible. Also, for birds and many other species actually, there is a positive relationship between body size and the mass of eggs that it can produce. So the larger the species, the more number of offspring it can produce, the more number of eggs it can produce, or egg mass. Now you can decide to, within the same mass you can have many eggs, or you can have one large egg as well. But what has been seen, so basically there's a positive relationship between body size and fecundity. But what has also been seen is that this is for two species, two groups, one is pigeons and falcons. It has also been seen that while the investment in egg production increases with body size, the relative investment reduces. So what is seen is that within these groups, the larger bodied species, they invest a lower proportion of energy in egg production. Is that clear? So the larger ones, so basically it goes to show that those species are investing a lot in their own growth and spare very little for egg production. But the ones which are smaller, they are actually expending a greater proportion of energy compared to their body size in producing eggs. Okay, so you can see that growth and fecundity in the inverse relationship between that here itself. Is that clear to everyone? So as your body size goes up, overall you are investing more in fecundity, but the relative investment decreases. Okay. So this basically this results in an inverse relationship between body mass and overall reproductive productivity. Because the larger you are actually investing more in relatively more resources in your own growth and lesser in reproduction. And this has been seen across, this is for 966 species of birds. And this relationship holds true even after you account for phylogenetic relatedness. Okay? So that's what it is. And this particular study is very interesting because they looked at the role of many other traits as well on fecundity after accounting for body size differences. So we already found that it's got an inverse relationship. Reproductive productivity has an inverse relationship with body size. So even after accounting for that, so in this graph, let me explain this first. These light gray bars show the effect of quantitative effect of this particular trait on reproductive productivity after body size has been accounted for, and the darker gray ones show the effect after body size and phylogenetic relationship has been accounted for. So both are pretty much similar in this case. So here you can see that migrants tend to invest more in reproductive productivity as compared to non-migrants. Similarly, species which produce precocial young. Precocial youngs are basically the ones which can immediately start walking after they are hatched. Those species, they tend to invest more in reproductive productivity than those which produce atricial young ones, like all these naked chicks you see in songbirds and all. So, and they've also explored food habits. They found that species which feed on vegetation tend to have higher reproductive productivity as compared to other uh, species which feed on other things like invertebrates, nectar, or fruit. Okay. So you can see that all these lifestyle choices that a species makes has effects on its reproductive productivity. Okay. Then coming to another thing that I talked about in the stages of life history, there's also the decision to be made on how often should a individual breed, right? So one of them, so there are two contrasting strategies. One is seminal parity, where there is one reproductive effect in a lifetime. Okay, so they invest everything in one reproductive event, produce lots of eggs or young ones, and then they die. So this strategy is mostly seen in insects and other invertebrates. And most of these species are basically small, short-lived, and grow in more unstable habitats. And any environmental effect, so because they are investing everything in one episode, uh, any environmental stochastic peak can have a very disastrous effect on that particular species. During that, if something goes wrong, basically reproduction fails for the entire season. The other contrasting strategy is iteroparity, where they produce fewer young ones but many times during a lifespan. Okay, so they have multiple cycles of reproduction. So it also means this is where the trade-offs come into play. Because you're getting many chances to reproduce, that means that you have to make decisions about how much you need to invest in growing, how much do you need to invest in reproduction, etc. And most birds, or rather all birds, are iteroparous, as is obvious. And finally, it has to decide on how much parental investment should it put in into parental care. So that depends on how many offspring you produce to begin with. In one contrasting thing is like fishes and all, they just produce thousands of eggs and they basically invest zero energy in parental care in most cases. But with birds, you have these two situations. One is where they have they invest shorter amount of time or resources in incubating the egg, but produce very helpless chicks, which need a lot of parental care. Okay, so this is seen in most passerines, woodpeckers, swallows, etc. And the other contrasting thing is in this case, in the first case, the chicks are called the species are called atricial birds. The second case is where they invest more time in incubation and produce chicks which are quite ready to run within a day or two of hatching. So they don't have to invest as much energy in feeding them because they start feeding immediately by themselves. In the first case, the parent has to feed them for a very long time. So on a continuum, this is how the birds lie along the spectrum of parental care. So you can see smaller passerines tend to produce artificial young ones, so they invest a lot in parental care. Whereas larger birds produce precocious chicks, which are quite ready to fend for themselves. Okay, so this is where we'll end.